Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Women Transforming Technology session on employee activism, forces for change. For me, an extremely relevant topic in today's world, given where we're at. I'm Karen Taylor, Chief Diversity Officer for Workday, and I'm proud to share that Workday is a strong supporter of women in technology, as well as being a sponsor of Women Transforming Technology for the fourth year in a row. We're also a member of the Women Transforming Technology Consortium. It's my pleasure to introduce the speakers for this session. Today, we are joined by Doctors Melissa Abad and Marianne Cooper, both from Stanford VMware's Women's Leadership Innovation Lab. Dr. Abad is a sociologist responsible for leading the lab's intersectional leadership agenda. She also collaborates with the Seeds of Change program, which is a leadership initiative focused on training and supporting young women in STEM as they transition through high school and college to successful tech careers. And Dr. Cooper was a lead researcher for Lean In, Women, Work, and the Will to Lead by Sheryl Sandberg, which most of us are familiar with. She's also a contributor to leanin.org. She's a contributing writer to The Atlantic and a LinkedIn influencer. She's also an expert on gender, women's leadership, diversity and inclusion, financial security, and economic inequality. So with that, please join me in welcoming Dr. Abad and Dr. Cooper.
Thanks so much. Hi, everyone. We're excited to take an hour and talk about activism. And so I'm going to kick off the session and talk about 10 minutes or so, and then Melissa's going to talk about change agents on the ground. And then we'll open it up for discussion. We have our colleague, Carolyn Samard, who's the managing director of our lab, who'll be monitoring chat and can help facilitate the Q&A after. So please, as we're talking, if you have questions that come up, ask them through chat, or if you have ideas or things you want to talk about, we're really looking forward to the conversation during this hour. So to begin, this is just an overview of what we're going to talk about in the beginning of the session today. So we'll talk about activism. We're going to talk about how to conceptualize activism, talk about insider activism in this highly politicized moment. And it's been several years of a highly politicized moment. And at the end, we'll talk about COVID-19, but it's sort of an interesting trend that this activism is likely to continue. We're going to talk about consumers and social media's role in activism, change agents on the ground, and Melissa will share her insights and expertise on that, activism during COVID-19. We're going to spend some time talking about organizational responses and then the consequences to different types of responses, and then open it up for questions and discussion after that. So the past few years have been highly politicized. Social movements are always with us, but they ebb and flow over time, depending on different circumstances, different sort of societal events that take place. But we've had in the last probably 5 years or more, just an uptick in like Me Too, Black Lives Matter, and then sort of things that are happening that society weighs in on. So the Google memo, the immigration ban, the transgender ban in North Carolina. A lot of pressing social issues are upon us, and people are feeling that and taking very big stands, and not just personally, but also in the workplace. So it's really, this slide is to just set the stage of the broader political moment that we're in as the framework through which we are going to think about activism. There's been a lot of research on social movements, on activism, and this is just a way to conceptualize it because there's a lot of overlap in any particular example. So this just is a way of kind of distilling the different actors in all of this. So sometimes firms themselves can be activists. They can take a particular stand on a social issue like PayPal did in North Carolina with all the bathroom politics. But increasingly, we're seeing companies take political stands. So firms in and of themselves can be activists. A lot of research has been done on insider activists. So these are full members of the targeted organization. So most likely employees, so people inside an organization who are pushing for change. And there's a way of thinking about those employees in terms of tempered radicals, and my colleague Melissa will discuss that soon. And then we have the intermediate cases here, where there's a partial or temporary member of a targeted organization. So sometimes it can be shareholders. You can think about activist shareholders that may push a particular kind of agenda, maybe kind of wanting the company to take up a target or a stance about diversity and inclusion, maybe pay equity. Students across college campuses and universities have really pushed the universities to take certain stands or to not have partnerships with certain entities or certain countries. So these are more intermediate cases. And then we have outsider activists. So these are non-members of targeted organizations. So social movement activists. And we can think about the Me Too movement more broadly, coming in as a good example of this, where people involved in the Me Too movement will kind of critique a particular company or organization for how they're handling sexual harassment or not doing anything about it. So there's really a continuum of ways activism takes place out in the world and in organizations. But this is just a useful way of conceptualizing it. And of course, in real time, people can be in multiple places. They can both be an employee inside a company and a member of a social movement. So this is just a useful conceptualization as we're thinking through this topic. Right now, activism is seen on all sides for the same issue. And so it spreads really quickly across this continuum. If you think of any of these dimensions, like Me Too, companies definitely were taking much more public stances on sexual harassment, that it won't be tolerated. Insider activists, shareholders, or intermediate cases where shareholders were really pushing for companies to report on sexual harassment. Insider activists, people on the ground inside companies, demanding that their company either update their policies or pushing back on companies who had, in the employees' view, been too tolerant of bad behavior. And then we have the outsider activists of things like Time's Up, other women's groups focused on sexual harassment and mistreatment in the workplace, really taking stands. But in any of, we have a large set of issues here: Black Lives Matter, the Google memo, we had Charlottesville, the immigration ban, the Women's March. Hate crimes have gone up since Trump entered office, and now COVID-19. So people, I think, feel this psychologically and emotionally, this sort of uptick in issues that are really important to people, that are about a set of values, a perspective on the world about how people should be treated. And this is really leading to an unprecedented need for a fast response among organizations. I'd say for the most part, the way we had thought about activism was that it didn't happen all the time inside companies. But with this set of issues in this particular moment, there's been a back and forth between people's lives inside their company as employees or as shareholders, or as students on a university campus, and then their personal lives and their personal politics. So what research has found, and what we all can see, is that activism does lead to change. So activism from both inside and outside the company can cause firms to make concessions or even change their behavior or adopt different policies. And these are just a few examples that my colleague Sarah Sewell, who is a professor at the Graduate School of Business at Stanford, used these when she's a social movement scholar and looks at how social movements can impact organizations. But these are examples she will talk about, which are, political protests that cause multinational firms to divest from Myanmar and Burma because of human rights violations. There's been a lot of environmental activism that's resulted in firms, adopting voluntary emission controls or, changing their policies about a variety of environmental concerns. We saw a lot of LGBTQ activism, leading Fortune 500 companies to adopt a range of policies, including domestic partner benefits, but other things like non-discrimination statements and things like that, to kind of push forward tolerance and acceptance and support. And then with the Black Lives Matter movement, we saw Google giving, over $2 million to help fund that movement. So there's been definitely consequences and real actions that have resulted from activism along all those different fronts. Typically, the way activism is studied in organizational contexts is what's called insider activism when we're looking at employees. So these are, again, full members of the target organization. These are often employees. It is the most common form of workplace activism in which insiders take action to address internal problems or internal issues. And this is a quote from my colleague, Sarah Sewell. She said, typically workplace activism is focused on issues internal to the firm. Workers go on strike because they're unhappy with pay or working conditions. They push companies to offer domestic partner benefits or improve their environmental practices. The goal is to get the company itself to change its practices in some way. And we still see that. And Melissa will talk about what's happening right now with COVID-19. But we still see this very common form of activism called insider activism. But what's different about the political moment that we're in and what I'm calling insider activism 2.0 and highly politicized times is that the activism has moved beyond not just like how I want my company to do things, but it's an activism that's focused on sort of how the company conducts itself. What kind of ethical business practices does it follow or not follow? There's also been a push for activism to focus on, for organizations to take stands on political and social issues, particularly during the Trump administration. So employees are really in this moment asking if their company is behaving in a way that aligns with their values more broadly. Often there can be kind of like somebody's personal politics and then the organization that they work for. What we saw in the last 4 years or so is employees looking at different ways their company was operating or different things they were doing or not doing, and coming to some different conclusions. So some of the things that started happening were an expectation that companies should take a stand on a political issue. So employees at Microsoft, for example, wrote a letter to the CEO asking the CEO to have Microsoft stop working on projects with immigration and border control. So those were kind of ethically minded decisions. Other things that happened, and it's called the Never Again Pledge a couple years ago. 600 engineers, designers, and business executives signed this pledge. And the pledge highlighted the role that business and governments had played in sort of carrying out racial or ethnic-based and religious discrimination, even genocide. And so the people who signed this Never Again pledge, they agreed to take action inside their own company to ensure that their company never created like a database or any other kind of tool or some other system that could be used to those kinds of ends. And that if they saw anything along those lines, that they would become whistleblowers or resign from their company. So in that example, the Never Again pledge, it's about how their company should be and what their company should do, but it's also them taking on a personal commitment about the type of work they will do and the type of company they will work for and their role in sort of a broader kind of humanity. And this is very rare, and this is again Sarah Sewell, who said workplace politicking of this kind is highly unusual. Publicly committing to quit is an unusual brand of what is called insider activism. Normally, those inside companies who are pushing for change use a more limited repertoire of tactics because they are dependent on their employer for their livelihood. Right after the 2016 election, I interviewed people working broadly in the tech industry who are really doing a lot of political organizing inside their companies and wanting their companies to take stands on the travel ban. In fact, many tech companies signed on to the amicus brief fighting that in the legal in the law. I asked people when I was interviewing them, well, aren't you worried about your job? And every time I asked that question, I kind of got this, what do you mean response, which I think had to do, first of all, with it was a very strong job market. Two, a lot of people I was talking with were engineers who felt like if they got fired for engaging in those kind of politics, that they could find another job more readily. But usually people are worried about what their activism is going to do. If they get labeled as troublemakers, for example, they may get retaliated against or lose their job. And so the fact that a lot of people at the time were not as worried about that was kind of also unique about that political moment. Since that time, we have seen more employees coming forward and talking about how they have been retaliated against for taking particular stands and pushing their companies to do certain things or criticizing their companies and being retaliated against, which is often the case and has been known for quite some time in the research that scholars do on activists inside companies. Consumers are really watching this all play out. 64% of global consumers agree that CEOs should take the lead on change rather than waiting on government to impose it. So there's a certain kind of corporate social responsibility ethic that's emerging among consumers. For a long time, it was sort of conventional thought that CEOs should never take a political stand because they didn't want to alienate any kind of particular segment of the consumer base, but it's actually becoming more of an expectation among consumers. The Rock Center for Corporate Governance at Stanford University, like a year or so ago, released a study that they found that 65% of the public and 71% of millennials think that CEOs of large companies should use their position and influence to advocate for the social, environmental, or political issues they care about personally. So these are majorities of the public, and whatever way we define the public, consumers or employees, are really expecting and coming to expect that leaders of companies have a point of view on many of the things that unfold every day. And so this has also changed the terms of the debate. And oftentimes it's no longer acceptable to consumers or to employees for companies to just stay silent. And so social media has actually played a big role in all of this as well, because it amplifies issues very, very quickly. Things can blow up as leaders can find themselves in the eye of the storm, so to speak. And my colleague Carolyn Smard talks about a hashtag waiting to happen. And I think that kind of ups the ante a little bit. It used to be a lot easier, I think, to keep things silent with non-disclosure agreements, et cetera. But now there's a very easy way to make information public. And this is from a professor, Aaron Chatterjee at Duke University, who said breaking stories play out on social media, which is basically just a microphone that's always on. And that means that the people behind the microphone, the CEOs in this case, are expected to speak and have opinions on things. And that wasn't the case even just 5 or 10 years ago. So CEOs' roles, in addition to running a business and making sure employees are being taken care of, also at this point have to be thinking about the set of political issues that may hit at any given time and how they're going to respond. So now I'll turn it over to my colleague Melissa, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen and she's going to start to talk about change agents on the ground.
Thank you, Marianne, as I try to share this. Thank you for your patience. So yes, so I think, again, I want to thank Marianne for setting us up for to understand what's going on the ground. And in terms of understanding change agents with regards to what's going on in COVID and employee activism more generally, there's two things I want to discuss. First, the idea of tempered radicals, and second, the idea of employee resource groups. So first, in terms of tempered radicals, what is a tempered radical? They're people who work within the system to advance values such as equity, trust, and transparency. Now, what does that look like? They tend to have a deep commitment to these values, and their strategy is rock the boat without falling out of it, right? And so what do they have in common? First, they speak the truth even in difficult situations, right? And the work I've done around women of color in tech and finance and studying diversity more broadly, there's a lot of conversations about what language we should use when naming and trying to address difficult situations. Second, building networks of change agents. What I've been able to observe in the last 3 years as a member of the lab team is looking at how these networks are built and sustained around questions of diversity and improving the workplace outcomes of marginalized groups in the workforce. Third, there's this question of the status quo, right? And the extent to which they have a bias towards action, even small, to create sustainable change, right? So tempered radicals, how they create change is really just moving the envelope just a little bit, right? Moving the arrow just a little bit, right? Because the understanding is if we want to create long-lasting change, it has to take these small, it's a question of these small actions, right? And gaining buy-in to then move the envelope, right? And for people who aren't living certain realities, that can be really hard, which is why, right, the strategy towards action are these small actions, right? So where do employee resource groups fit in this conversation about temporary radicals, right? And what I've seen in the last 3 years, it really revolves around how we understand leadership and how we foster belonging for marginalized groups. So how are they tempered radicals in this space? First, there's a lot of work employee resource groups do around recruitment and retention, right? Right here, I feature a picture from the Society of Hispanic Professional Engineers National Convention. I haven't been able to go, but I've gone to similar events. And what I see is a lot of professionals in your companies going to these events to talk about how much they love working there, to recruit younger talent, and to recruit diverse talent, right? Because we understand, or a lot of more members of ERGs understand that to increase the diversity of their workplace, attending these events is really important, not only for their company's visibility, but to flood the pipeline, if you would. Second, leadership training. The programming employee resource groups offer your company, right, is a really great way to highlight leadership and to develop leadership, right? Both of its members and of the people organizing the events. Next are cultural events. I've been able to attend a few of these, whether it's like a rally around Martin Luther King Day that has happened every year where different Black and Latinx ERG leaders come together and mobilize their employees to really get informed about who Martin Luther King was and how important he was, right? So, and then there's events within the organization, right? And so whether it's your Black History Month, your Asian American History Month, there's a lot of events that ERGs put on for the company to inform their colleagues about what it means to be a member of the group. And they also put on events for their own membership, right? Meeting membership needs, whether it's leadership programming, bringing in guest speakers, or other forms of professional development, right? It's a place where they create community. Lastly, community activism, right? I mentioned Martin Luther King Day. I've also seen ERGs participate in Lunar New Year parades and other kinds of events in the community to really, again, make these jobs visible, make your organizations accessible to maybe members of the community who wouldn't think tech was possible. So yeah. So from here, right, when we think about insider activism, when we think about different forms of employee activism, there's a whole slew of pressures, and I want to go through them one by one. So I'm going to start at the top with employees, right? Employees are pushing for increased transparency, equity, and inclusion, right? And so they have to struggle against these media leaks and how they influence employee activism. Then there's brand pressures, right? And I'm moving clockwise, right? Employer brand pressures address significant consequences for employer brand and the ability to recruit and retain talent. Then there's activist investors, right? In fact, activist investors push for diversifying board and executive team as risk management. They also push for increased transparency. I've been able to attend a few webinars over the last few weeks where different people at companies are talking about, well, how do we make sure our investors are happy with how we're responding to what's happening with COVID? Then there's customers, right? I've also attended webinars where the customers are being talked about a lot, right? There's a demand that companies reflect their values. What's been really interesting to see is the conversations around values as COVID hits, right? As we deal with the economic security it's producing and how companies are responding to that to make customers happy, right? Because customers vote with dollars, right? And depending on how companies respond to what's going on, right? Like it's going to influence the number of customers who have access to your company. Then number 5, there's a threat of litigation. Marianne talked about sexual harassment. There's also concerns about pay equity and hiring and promotion discrimination. I'll talk a little bit about that with regards to the coronavirus. Then there's a context of divided political environment, right? With rapid policy changes affecting inclusion and equity, trust, and transparency, right? So where do companies sit with regard to these policy changes? As Marianne said, right, there's media and social media. Social media has accelerated the pace of conversations, right? There's an instantaneous feedback loop fueling the controversy, right? One of you just shared the link about the VP at Amazon resigning in response to what's happening with the workers on the ground in the warehouses, right? And the speed with which this is happening, the speed with which we are being informed, as we were prepping for this session, every day there were at least 3 new stories or 3 new actions being taken on. And it was like, how do we put this all together? And so companies are forced to respond to this instantaneous feedback loop. Number 8, community and broader social movements, right? So what's going on in the offices may be different from what's going on in the ground. And I'll talk about that a little bit about that later, right? But there's push for specific responses and actions from company to what's going on outside. And these competing movements may have different demands. As someone who studies women of color, I'm at the crux of how women are making demands with regards to certain issues and how communities of color are making demands with certain issues. And sometimes there's this assumption that the interests are different, right? And so how do companies respond to these conflicts? So we just want to summarize these convening pressures to flesh out the different ideas that Marianne introduced, and to really just paint how complicated this climate is, right? Because there's different audiences that have different needs, and how do companies and employees respond to these needs? So now that we've given you a bunch of concepts and talked about different strategies and different ways to think about what activism looks like in the company, we really wanted to talk about some of the initial strategies we've been and activities that we've learned about in the last couple months, right? One, we want to recognize it's relatively early, right? Shutdown in the Bay Area started March 16th, right? And so we want to signal that this is just the beginning of a conversation, right? So we may not know everything, right? It's only a few of us following this conversation, but we do want to highlight some of the things that we have seen, right? Which is there have been furloughs. Companies are trying to figure out how to, make investors happy as economic insecurity increases, right? We're not traveling as much. Conferences are being canceled. The opportunities to engage with customers, with coworkers, right, in this global economy have been really hard, right? So what does this look like? What does employee activism look like in the age of coronavirus? There have been walkouts, right? People on the front lines don't have the benefits, some of the same benefits people in more privileged positions at companies have, right? And so they've walked out. They're scared about their health. There have also been sick outs, right, at different companies. Then there's formal organizing, right? As a student of labor history, right, I understand the power unions had in the beginning of the 20th century, and it's been throughout the 20th century has been on the decline, right? But now we're seeing an uptick, right? And Wired just came out with a story of how some of its employees are trying to formally organize, right? There's consumer activism. One of the webinars I was on was with Ascend, which is an Asian professional networking group. And they talked about the importance of going to Chinese restaurants, right? The rise of anti-Asian racism since coronavirus hit is pretty available online. And so one of the ways they're encouraging people to fight against that is to go to Chinese restaurants, because Chinese restaurants are seeing a decline in customers. Another thing I've seen in terms of employee activism is the philanthropy, the grassroots philanthropy from different tech organizations, whether it's Techeria organizing funds for undocumented workers, right, who won't have access to the stimulus checks because they don't have social security numbers, even though they have tax ID numbers. Then there's other GoFundMe pages for other insecure workers, small businesses, and contract workers, right? Some of the most marginalized workers are not getting access, and employees at different tech companies are trying to take care of these employees, right? And so it's been really interesting to see how different groups are organizing for the well-being of broader society, right? So that's one form. Then there's organizational responses to activism, and there's a few. There's a couple of types of responses. There's denial, right? Maybe it's not a problem, and it's not a problem that faces us. 2, there's policy change. We've seen this with parental leave policies. We've seen this with some diversity programming over the years. Then there's public statements, right? How companies are responding to this state of affairs as a result of COVID. And lastly, there's philanthropic gestures, right? Whether it's funding programs from tutoring to help the pipeline, to funding organizations that are helping make masks, right? So organizations can go from denying there's an issue to putting their money where their mouth is, right? And it's been really interesting to see what companies are doing, or what they've been doing in the last couple of months. Now, consequences to organizational responses. There's positive consequences and negative consequences. I'll start with the positive. First, when employees respond, when organizations respond positively to the context, employees are happier. Consumers appreciate the political stance organizations are taking. Having a public voice in this space also increases talent, right? If companies are responding to social issues in a way that creates systemic change, the younger talent who are more interested in diverse workplaces, who are more interested in ethical organizations, will go to the ones who they think have ethical responses. Then there's an increase in firm performance, right? I've heard throughout the day conversations about loyalty and talent, and how happy employees are loyal to their companies and are investing in improving the culture, right? So if companies are responding positively to these highly politicized times, right, then you're gonna have your employees respond. It's gonna be a positive feedback loop, right? Then on the other hand, there's negative consequences, right? If you're not responding to these things, or if you're ignoring the problem, right? This could cause reputational damage. If companies are not taking a stand that aligns with the values of their customers, their investors, or their employees, right, then these audiences are not going to be happy with the company. Second, there's boycotts, right? Like May Day just happened. May 1st, I kept getting, my social media feeds were fed with like companies to boycott because they're not treating their customers well, right? So there were certain online companies, certain online companies were being, like didn't receive a huge customer base on May 1st because of the way they're treating their hourly employees. Then there's a talent shortage, right? If people are walking out or, are participating in sick outs, right? You're losing your talent. The frontline workers at, and these tech companies that are delivering our goods at grocery stores and hospitals, right? If you're not creating a workplace, if you're not responding to these insecure times, right, that's supporting the values of these audiences, people are going to want to leave, right? And then it hits to the bottom line. All these things interact and then inform how you do financially, right? Which again goes back to your investors' interests. And if you're not doing anything right to the point where you're losing money, investors aren't going to be happy, right? So when we think about the political climate and how it's affecting organizational performances, and employees and companies have to interact and figure out what's best for all these different audiences. Okay, so we've given you a bunch of concepts to work with. We outlined what we're beginning to see with regards to COVID, and we want to open it up to some questions. So here they are. First, what issues are employees continuing to push on? What new issues have emerged? What have been effective organizational responses? What have been ineffective ones? Which employees are engaging in changing agency? And then what practices are working at your workplace that others may benefit? So these are some of the questions that Marianne and I came up with as we were talking. I'm sure you have more, but we just wanted to start with these and see where the conversation took us.
Excellent. While I invite people to raise their hand if they want to contribute a question, a comment, or an idea, I thought I would start by throwing to you both, while people are taking the time to raise their hands or ask their questions on chat. There's a question that came up about how do companies best balance the different interests, right? So sometimes if employees are activists, they may want super fast change right now on something that the company may not be ready to fully do, but they're willing to do something. So is there like a way for companies to work with activists and really leverage their passion and commitment? But also meeting the organization where it's at to implement change in a way that's satisfactory to, you know, if you say the business and leadership interests and the activists' interests.
Well, that's tricky, isn't it?
Yeah, sure is.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it depends. It obviously depends on the issue and how far apart the activists and the company are. I think people become activists because they care deeply about things that often have a big societal impact or are having a big societal cost, and that the first step is really, I think all too often, many people just don't want to hear from the activists. And I don't think just turning away is going to make the problem any easier. But facilitating conversations where you can learn about why the activists care about what they care about, and what are the top things the activists would like changed, can be a way of at least beginning the conversation and showing respect and like mutual respect for the different approaches or sides of an issue. I think often the world doesn't move or change as fast as activists or even I might want. And so in lieu of systemic rapid change, what's possible? And I'm always surprised at, you know, how little sometimes people know about the different issues in their around them or that they're engaging in. And so at least beginning the dialogue and trying to learn about it, and then thinking through what's possible given the resources that we have as a company, the space we're in, what seems feasible.
I really like that comment, and it reminds me because we work on a university campus. There's a lot of student activism, and some of the most productive conversations I've seen is essentially leadership and student activists trying to understand each other's point of views and also educating each other, right? So for if a student doesn't quite understand the politics of university decision making and how the budget works, if they hear from the leader, they may understand better what the constraints are and then help co-create the solution that would be beneficial to both parties. And so your point about dialogue and really trying to understand each other's point of view is really well taken, which takes an investment. Absolutely. There's another question on the Q&A. So how are leaders supposed to walk this line, which is, where companies are being asked to take a stand around specific social issues. And we know all of these issues are now becoming politicized. And so how do inclusion leaders or leaders in general encourage the stand and yet don't alienate members of their own workplaces that have a different political point of view or affiliation? Or so how do you bring along people in the conversation that may have a completely different stand? So for example, being a Republican in a more liberal workforce Silicon Valley company.
I think it comes back to organizational values, right? Just to build on the thread that Marianne started about meeting people where they are. And one of the things I found most interesting, whether it's at universities, at workplaces, is figuring out where the values align, right? One of the things employees have in common is to a certain degree, right? Is a commitment to the organization's mission and its values, right? And so if we start at what we have in common, right? That's where we're going to gain people who are on opposite sides.
Mm-hmm. That's great. That's a really good point. So finding the common ground, linking it back to the organizational values as the rallying kind of point. We heard from one practitioners too about several initiatives to have difficult conversations across difference and across different point of views, and you know, that included like, I voted for Trump, come and talk to me and ask me any question, and some of these kind of political tensions that are happening in the workplace are really fostering that dialogue. Thank you so much for this. So I want to invite people to raise their hands if they want to offer a comment or an answer to one of the questions that our speakers have suggested. So if you want to use the raise hand function, or you can also add your comment in chat.
And let us know if it'd be easier to repost the questions that we pose in at the end.
Yeah, why don't you put those up? I think that would be helpful. So what are you seeing are sources activism in your organization or forces around you? What have you seen be very effective organizational responses? Not necessarily on your own, in your own workplace. You don't have to name where you work if that's not comfortable, or what you've seen out there. What kind of change agencies are you seeing from different groups of employees? So there is a comment on the chat that a company that takes a position on a specific issue and according to its values is a draw to employees, such as zero carbon footprint and things like that. Absolutely. That is one of the talent strategies that companies can really deploy here. Okay, any hands raised? Okay, Samantha, I think Walter is gonna unmute you. Go ahead, Samantha.
Hi. Yeah, I think it's really interesting because we still have some questions around diversity and inclusion, where I think our company in the past has done a pretty good job with hiring, but then has had trouble with retention and promotion. And, you know, trying to raise some of these questions around equity and transparency didn't really work. So I'm curious to hear about other approaches that you think might be helpful. I'm trying to, you know, as a person in a slightly higher role than some of the other underrepresented members, continue to manage up around some of these issues, but I'm curious to hear what else we might be able to try.
Yes, so that often is a problem, is getting a more diverse group of people in the door, but then they don't rise up, or they, you know, rise up the ladder, so to speak, or they leave because it's not what it was cracked up to be, or inclusion isn't as inclusive as it could be. And so then the what you're pointing to is the accountability for those dynamics happening. And I think what it signals is an incomplete strategy, is it's working in one area, but it's not like a comprehensive strategy that's designed to really keep pushing improvements. And so in those kinds of circumstances, sometimes it's asking questions like, what are the numbers on rates of promotion? What are the criteria for advancement? How do you explain the fact that, if it's turnover or whatever it is, that, more people of color are leaving than white people? I think often the case is that either the data is not collected, or if it is collected, it's not being looked at systematically. So asking questions that are not, there's certainly something implied when someone asks a question like that, but asking for information should not be problematic. And I find when people have to explain trends, that's when there's room for more dialogue, or to kind of a moment where people can realize that they're either they don't really know why it's happening, and therefore it creates the space to start relooking at that, reinvesting in that, or doing something differently. So that's where I always go to is, well, what is the data telling us?
Mhm.
And you shouldn't receive too much pushback for even asking a question like that. That seems like a pretty neutral question.
And the ultimate point of meeting, we talk a lot about small wins in our work. And so it sounds like, sometimes there's the ideal or the activism and where you really want the thing to go. And you have to meet the organization where it's at, right? And so finding where the nudge is here, and realizing that you may only be able to carry it forward just through a small win in the right direction, but over time you can start making that movement. And Karen Taylor just added some of her thoughts on some of the data that may help leaders.
I also wanted to say, in terms of all of this, one of the underlying theme is data collection. Like what data is your company collecting? And one piece I'd like to add are exit interviews, right? Thinking about the women of color I've been able to talk to and interview over the last 2.5 years, right? Their tolerance threshold for microaggressions and other forms of bias is so high that it's usually like that when they leave, they basically have amassed a laundry list of things that they just can't take anymore, right? Mm-hmm. And so the question is are you asking people why they're leaving your company? Mm-hmm. I think an easy way to paint over the brush is like, oh, well, no one stays at the same company for like more than 3 years, no big deal. But when to your point about recruitment versus retention, right? People of color and other underrepresented groups leave faster and leave at higher rates. Right? So what information are your companies gathering to document what's going on that is explaining that difference, right? And if they don't realize that, then maybe they should be documenting who's leaving at what rates and break that stuff down by race and gender.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And Katie adds, it is hard because by the time you did the exit interview, like you said, Melissa, so much has already happened that should have been addressed before, right? We heard in one of our CP meetings, one of our corporate affiliates meetings about Intel creating a program called Warmline that provides an anonymous kind of confidential setting for people to raise these issues before they're considering walking out the door, right? And hopefully fix them before. There's another very interesting question in our Q&A board, which is, how do you advise that companies essentially take a stand, and where is taking the stand likely to perhaps create too much activism? And is too much activism such a possibility? So the person on the Q&A said, that Google really tried to have they formed their company around a do no evil value, and they are seeing a ton of activism as a result. And so is one lesson here, be careful what you wish for when you create your values, when you encourage people to drive change, or how do you walk that line as an organization to try to figure out, like, where do you really foster the activism versus where you may be faced with so much? That's a hard one. I like it. I like it.
Melissa? No.
Just kidding. I start with that.
No.
I think, and one of the things we talk about in the lab a lot is trial and error, right? And again, this issue of time is so important, right? And what's interesting as a social scientist in studying tech, right, let's say, is how much tech wants the answer yesterday. And as social scientists, we know it takes time because there's things we can't account for. And so the first thing I would say is giving yourself permission and giving yourself time, giving yourself permission to make mistakes, giving yourself permission that part of this is an experiment, right? I don't know that anyone saw COVID coming. I don't think anyone saw that it would take more than 3 months to fix the problem, right? And I put that in quotation marks on purpose, but I digress. And so I think this forced slowdown, because that's what COVID is causing, is a forced slowdown, is actually, for some, as social scientists, giving us the opportunity to talk about, like, yeah, let's take time to figure out what's really going on and strip back, right? This pressure to keep going, right? And keep moving. Sorry for the hands moving fast. Life is meta. But there's no right answer. It's a conversation about solution versus process, right? And the solution doesn't happen yesterday. The solutions happens by giving us time to have a fluid process where we give ourselves permission to make mistakes and realize that we're not going to get the answer right away. And that maybe the first answer, we give ourselves time to see what happens before we scale it, because scaling an answer that hasn't been tested is not going to work. And I think a lot of tech professionals know both sides of that conversation. So that's how I would answer that question.
I really like that. It's almost like having a growth mindset towards the messiness of activism in the workplace and seeing what the opportunities for learning and progress are.
Yes.
Love that.
Well, and I think depending, so much is thinking through the space, the particular industry a company is in, and what issues are more central to that company. But there's a broader set of what I would just call like basic human rights issues. And, that's where the domestic partner benefits, the non-discrimination, statements came up. And it really is thinking through from a company perspective, and I'm not kidding, but do we want to have those kinds of values? And if we do, it is actually going to require that you practice what you preach, and an openness to being called out when you are not. And to the degree that you are open to that as a leader, then it creates space for more activism, and you will get pushed more, but you may end up in a better place. It will be difficult and uncomfortable, and you certainly won't always get it right. But I think as we kind of create culture change on a lot of different social issues, companies too are having to move forward, and that I think some leaders come to see that this is actually quite beneficial, because it's just about treating people fairly and equitably. And so if you're being, the sort of the return to the business on talent, but also just doing the right thing, that those two things can go together. So I don't think every company needs to take a stand on every single issue, but on the issues that are really central to it. So for tech companies, the travel ban was really important for a variety of reasons, but from a business perspective, they get talent from all over the world. They need the free flow of talent. And there's a talent shortage, but they also have employees who were individually impacted, and their families were impacted, and they're going to stand by those employees. That issue may be less salient to a company based somewhere else that doesn't have as much of an immigrant constituency, which doesn't mean they don't care about those issues. That's just not the issue they're going to stand up for. There's a bigger question about corporate citizenship. And I also think we're seeing a meta move, that there are more moral and ethical stances that companies should take. I think the pandemic is reinforcing that. And so maybe in the 80s and early 90s, we kind of went this other way, that it was like shareholder value and all of these things mattered. The monetary metrics mattered more. And we're starting to see a pendulum swing in the other direction. And it's not easy to navigate through. And I actually think it takes even stronger leadership, people who are more thoughtful, more have more of a global viewpoint, and even a historical understanding of all these issues, to really come to terms with where it makes sense for a company to speak out, and to do so in a way that's thoughtful and productive and moves that social issue forward. So I think it's actually a hard time to lead.
Yeah, that's a really useful framework, because you can think about it as moving from a strictly shareholder value model to a stakeholder value model, which is, you have shareholders, but you have other stakeholders, right? You also have your employees, your community, your consumers, the country you live in, this and that and the other, and how do you balance those needs? I like the idea almost of when you two talk about like leaders and values and organizations deciding what they're going to focus on and also be willing to experiment and learn. I know that some executives we've worked with have led some simulations, for example. Okay, so we're being accused of a Me Too moment, or tomorrow our employees walk out because of this issue. How will we respond, right? And so having these kinds of, if you know you're going to be pushed on specific issues, you can run almost executive leadership or leader simulations to say, what would it mean for us to respond in the way that really lives up to this value, or what are we prepared to do or not do? And so that seems like a good leadership development focus as well in this day and age, right? It's almost like they have the media interview simulations kind of thing, but this is more like a social movement response simulation, which would be extremely beneficial for leaders. Okay, we have 5 more minutes, so I want to go back to see if anybody else wants to raise their hand or add a question in chat. What are you seeing in your organization? What are some of the effective responses you're seeing? Or you can add the question in the Q&A. One of the things that's coming up on the chat is that because COVID-19 is in kind of evolving and it's a moving target, the issues, Melissa, that you have raised about, for example, contract workers, activism on behalf of them, activism on behalf of employees in the front line, and sick leave and paid leave, for example. What are some of the next wave that we're going to see, right? It seems like the next wave is going to be about how do we keep each other safe as we return to work, and what does that look like? Would love to see if you guys have thoughts about what may be coming next. Crystal ball here.
Oh my God. I just read something about like everyone's asking for a crystal ball and these models, these scientific models, right? Like, and it's hard. Admit I'm a little bit of a, what's it called? I'm conservative, right? I don't know that we can talk about going back to work yet, right? Because I think it's a lot more complicated than that. I think we don't understand. And I'm not a scientist. I just was raised by a woman in healthcare, so there's things I'm sensitive to about how this works. Or how I think this is going to play itself out. I think we have to account for, again, it goes back to this idea of speed and process. We don't know what this is. We don't know what effect it's going to have. We don't know how it's transmitted. And some of us are more privileged than others in terms of being able to stay at work, right? And like, or being able to work from home. And so the question is like, what are we doing for ourselves and for our neighbors to like make sure this doesn't spread too quickly? Right? Because if I talk to other young people all the time about this, right? And like, well, we need to be doing X, Y, and Z. I was like, no, you need to be staying home and being aware of your privilege and like protecting the people who don't have benefits, right? So if we want to talk about going back to work, let's make sure we're following every ordinance that there is. As annoying as it is, coronavirus fatigue is real. Zoom fatigue is real. I feel it. We talk about it. My colleagues and I talk about it at a time. And so we have to be slow and we have to be careful, and we cannot rush this process because we don't know what it is. The different articles that have documented like how what happened with the Spanish flu and other kinds of diseases, this stuff takes time, right? And we may have we may be more technologically advanced than, the beginning of the 20th century, but so is the disease, right? Or so is this infection. I don't know what else to call it. And so 1, patience, 2, follow the ordinances, and 3, like, let's make sure we're taking care of ourselves and operating within our resources to make sure that like when we do go back, that we are as slow as slow as this is, and the rate at which we're like getting used to this is the rate at which we should go back to work.
I love it. And I think, go ahead, Marianne, go ahead.
The one, so I'll just add, and I'm trying to write about this slowly, is I think the sense-making framework that we bring to this is going to take time to emerge. But social catastrophes provide a moment in which significant change can happen because it illuminates everything that's broken and what needs to be fixed. And so if you think about other social catastrophes like the Great Depression, the framework that emerged and how we collectively made sense of what happened and what we needed to do to emerge from it was security. I think we're going to have a different frame this time around. And I'm writing about how I think it's going to be care because of the particular dynamics of the pandemic lend itself to highlighting care, how we care for each other, child care, health care, the lack of sick leave, the lack of paid family leave, all of these things, it illuminates it in a way that it's like, you can't even think of a more perfect way of illustrating this. So I'm simultaneously optimistic and pessimistic. I'm optimistic for the amount of social change that this could generate, but pessimistic because we just know inequality reproduces itself, and disadvantaged groups are really feeling it. So I look forward to continuing to make sense of all of this in real time. And please continue to send us your thoughts and ideas and any kind of activism or organizational responses you see. We're doing real-time sociology here, so.
Thank you so much, Marianne and Melissa, and all of the participants. And I certainly let's all of us think about our own role in fostering activism as this continues and continuing the productive dialogues between the insider change agents and the outsiders that are pushing our organizations. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.